morning from Berlin. I'm Andrew Gilmore, the Executive Director of the Berghoff Foundation, and we are very happy to welcome people to this special event on the role of China and the Gulf. Now, of course, the Gulf is an area that has had a number of geostrategic and political ramifications for large parts of the world. These have only increased in recent months with the great threat to ship maritime trade. And indeed, just this week, there have been reports of soldiers from Yemeni militias fighting in Ukraine, and perhaps the transfer of weapons from Russia in return. But we at Berghoff have been interested in watching with great interest China's growing influence in the region, which we see as something based on their shared desire for stability and peace. So today, we are very happy to have experts from China, from the Gulf, and from Europe to share their perspectives. And I'm particularly happy also to hand the floor to our moderator from Berghoff, Lara.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I would like to welcome you for joining us today and welcome our speakers. My name is Lara Azdam. I'm a Senior Project Manager at the Berghoff Foundation in the MENA unit, and I lead the project on exploring the role of increased China-MENA relations in the region. And so during this within this project, we hold virtual and in-person dialogue sessions, but also we produce research reports. And actually today, in today's webinar, in today's panel discussion, we would like to bring into the discussion some of the findings and the reflections from some papers produced on the aspects of China's growing ties with Gulf countries and what it means for Europe. Just briefly to go through the agenda, we will have two sessions. The first session we will look into the main parameters of China's involvement and also like the drivers and the trends from the perspective of China, from the perspective of from Gulf countries, and also from European perspectives. And then we will move on to the second session, where we will look into potential areas of cooperation between Europe, China, and the Gulf, and also basically how a European role could come into shape. After that, we will open the floor for questions and for questions and for comments for the discussion. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A feature. Yeah, we're happy to take it up towards the end. So first, if we can quickly get into it, I would ask Dr. Zhu Qiqi to start us off with the discussion. And I would like to first please introduce yourself to us, and then I would like to ask you to share with us your perspective on what are the main drivers and parameters and aspects of China's involvement within China's foreign policy towards the region, and what that means for in terms of economic trade, investment, but also mediation and deepening of political engagement, sorry, with different actors in the region. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Lara, and also thanks for the other speakers. I think this could be a very great opportunity for me to present here. First, a very short introduction of myself. I am Yiqi Zhou. I'm from the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Then we are based in Shanghai, focused on the international studies. And I personally work a lot on the Middle East security affairs, especially on the mediation of the conflict in the Middle East. For me, I think since the timing of my presentation is very short, 5 minutes, So I will just focus on also some of the themes of the listed by the Lara, which first is about introduction of the China's current engagement with the Arabic Gulf countries, and the second is also a brief summary of its characteristics. As for the first, the China's engagement with the Gulf Arabic countries, I would say such kind of engagement could be described into like 4 layers of the engagement. The first layer of engagement is the bilateral engagement. Actually, if you look at China's policy, we have like a tradition of maintaining the partnership diplomacy with all kinds of countries. Usually, for all kinds of the partnership relationship, it could be divided into several categories. The basic level is we say partnership. The second level is the strategic partnership. The third level is the comprehensive strategic partnership. With all 6 Arabic Gulf countries, I would say all of them have maintained at least a strategic partnership with China. And also there are also a lot of very specific projects in terms of its bilateral cooperation. The second layer is the China and the GCC cooperation. I would say 2 years ago, almost at this time, also on this, I would say on December, 2022. In that time in the Riyadh, the China have hosted the first China GCC summit in Riyadh, and also we have like issued on one hand a joint statement, and also a working agenda between China and the GCC countries from the 2023 to the 2027. This is like almost like a 5 years working agenda. The third layer is we say the China and the Arabic countries cooperation, because actually China and the Arabic cooperations, we have this type of mechanism for cooperation for very, very long times. It was almost at the beginning of even before the Beijing Olympic time, at the beginning of the 21st century. We have set up the China-Arabic Cooperation Forum, and certainly the Gulf Arabic countries are also very important part of this type of the cooperation mechanism. And I would say on this, just in this year, I think on May, and there is also a new round of the China-Arabic Cooperation Forum, and also like the head of the UAE and head of Bahrain also visit China during that forum. And also in that forum, we have also listed also some kind of the very guiding joint actions between China and the overall Arabic countries. In China, so far, we have like 8 joint actions, including from the common development, food security, and we say technological cooperation, civilization dialogue, youth development, even including we say the security and security and stability cooperation. The fourth layer is on some global level, like the Shanghai SCO, Shanghai Cooperative Organization, and also the BRICS, and also in the United Nations. Then China also maintained a very active engagement with the Gulf Arabic countries. And the second part is for the China's characteristics. I would say it will be mostly depend on I would say 3 key elements. The first is still as economic-driven development. But I would say the content of economic cooperation is evolving. Previously, it mostly focused on the China want to import from the Gulf countries as energy, and then China export as good trade commodities to the Gulf countries. But nowadays, such type of the trade relationship has almost become like a more deep cooperation in all the new, we say, cutting edge technological area, especially given the need of the Gulf countries wanting a more diversified and also a more modernized economy, and China certainly is working with them in kinds of maybe artificial intelligence, digital infrastructure, green technologies. Those could be and also with maybe electronic vehicles, solar panels. This could be the new area of the trade. And the second is on the political and the security. Traditionally, China has always, we say, maintained with a non-interference principle, which sometimes can make China have some kind of the soft power leverage in the Gulf Arabic countries. But I would say since the last year, especially since China's mediation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also this year, China's mediation between different Palestinian factions, China is now increasingly active in becoming a mediator to the political and security affairs in the Gulf Arabic countries. But that is not, I don't think that is, we say, a different distractions from its long-held, we say, non-interference principles. It's more like, in Chinese word, we usually call it, we say, more like a constructive engagement. The third element is certainly China want to cultivate a kind of a more, we say, civilizational partnership with Gulf Arabic countries, since both China and Gulf Arabic countries are belonging to the non-Western countries, which have its own unique value, political system, and also civilization. Certainly, China want to also promote this type of, with a civilizational dialogue between China and the Gulf Arabic countries. So I will first stop here, and I also look forward to learning from the other speakers. Thank you, Lara.
Thank you so much for also being brief and also for your enriching input. To build on that, I would like to move on to Dr. Saban to tell us more about the drivers of Gulf countries' positions on China. I think Dr. Chichi already touched a bit on that, but tell us more about, if you can tell us more about, the internal and external considerations that the Gulf countries have, their own visions, the energy transition, but also in terms of maritime security. How do the Gulf countries look at that in specific? Go ahead. Please introduce yourself to us briefly.
Okay, thank you, Lara. I'm Shaban Kardash from Qatar University Gulf Studies Center. We are both a research center, but at the same time, we are offering a master's and PhD degrees in the Gulf Studies. This is the only program throughout the world where you can find a specialized graduate program on the Gulf Studies. And then I will briefly outline the main parameters of the Gulf countries' interest in deepening their engagement with China. But of course, perhaps at the beginning, it might be useful to outline that this will be the broader parameters. But in the case of specific countries, they may be individual drivers. Of course, there's always a discussion about the Gulf, but here, as Dr. Yikshi also mentioned, we are talking about the Gulf Arab countries, particularly members of the GCC, but also Iran is also part of the Gulf, and then relationship between Iran and China. This is also one of the growing dimensions of the new geopolitics of the Middle East. So in my own outline, I will mainly look at the GCC member states' overall drivers when it comes to the deepening engagement with China. We could refer to a number of factors, but I guess the key theme is, the key concept is diversification. This is shaping not only energy, but also geopolitical considerations of these countries. Keeping that overarching concept in mind, let me underline a number of important drivers. The first one is the broader foreign policy orientations of the Gulf countries. This is also a debate outside of the China question. We see the rise of the Gulf in the MENA politics, but also globally. So the Gulf has been on the ascendance through the proactive, assertive policies, and even some scholars keep referring to the Gulfification of the Middle East politics. So, of course, there are different drivers of this trend, the collapse of the old Arab order and the rise of the Gulf monarchies as assertive actors throughout the MENA region. So this is also affecting their approach to China. But here, I think we should, or we could refer to what we may call the look east policies on the part of these countries as part of a diversification quest. And this look east is important because also it is related to the role of the United States and the West in general in the MENA region and in the Gulf in particular, considering all the discussions about a post-American world, a power transition, the rise of China at a global level. Like many parts of the international system, like in other regions, we see that the Gulf actors are also trying to look at the rising regions and rising powers, which is China. So look, East is quite a structural driver, but it's also a kind of important insurance against the future shape of the international order. Here, I guess there is no need to mention, but we could briefly emphasize the critical role played by the United States in terms of providing security in the Gulf. So most of these countries are dependent on the US security provisions when it comes to furthering their national security. And if the debate about the future of the American engagement takes a direction where the United States will be less involved, then these countries also need to find alternative arrangements. So as a rising power, of course, China comes to the fore. So in that sense, the relationship between China is an important leverage to manage the risks created by the power transitions. In the second level, I can emphasize the role of the new statecraft in the Gulf, which is also, again, I would say, in sync with the global trends. I mean, this is where we see that the Gulf political leaders, their strategic thinking, are also very much in line with the global strategic trends. And here we can refer to the role of connectivity, the agenda of connectivity, all major infrastructure projects, which were also emphasized by the speaker previously. This is becoming part of the new geopolitics. Sometimes we are talking about the return of the great power competition, but competition over major infrastructure projects, the connectivity are important part of the new statecraft. And I think this also plays a large role in the thinking of the Gulf leaderships, decision makers, when it comes to their relationship with the Gulf and China, sorry. So here, there's no need to mention BRI and the major infrastructure project offered by China, and they cannot be indifferent to these projects. So most of them have been looking for ways to find a place within these mega projects. Thirdly, we can talk about the Gulf sovereign welfare funds. Here, I guess the Gulf stands in a slightly different position when it comes to China's engagement in the broader MENA, in the sense that when we talk about China and Egypt, China and Iran, China is mainly on the giving side, right? The other MENA partners are on the receiving side. But here in this relationship between China and the Gulf, we can also talk about sort of a two-way relationship, in the sense that Gulf is not just a taker, but it's also a giver. And here the role of sovereign welfare funds is important, because what we see, unlike, again, the Chinese experience with China, Iran, Egypt, or Turkey in that respect, it is not just the Chinese money flowing into these regions, but the Gulf money is also flowing into China. Increasingly, we are seeing mutual investments, and this is becoming a part of the agenda between China and several of these countries. The next one is the vision plans, which needs to be emphasized, I guess. All of the GCC countries have their own vision plans, which is, again, part of a diversification agenda. There are economic drivers, but strategic drivers, but it also ties to another big issue, which is the energy transition, considering the critical role the energy geopolitics plays for these countries. But again, the future of world energy markets, the green agenda, the transformation of the energy scene, many of these countries see that there is room to collaborate with China. It is not just in the traditional sense of selling their own oil and gas to China, but how to cooperate in the energy transition. I guess this is also an important issue. Investments in the green energy technologies. This is where China is emerging as an alternative to the European alternative, which is, I guess, gonna play an important role. Yet another issue is about the technology transfers, partnerships in technology. We have seen the discussions about the 5G global rivalry over it, competition over it, the Western or US attempts to prevent the access of Chinese technology to third countries. But at the same time, what we know is that the Gulf countries, for their own economic, political, and social transformation plans, they also need to access to new advanced technology. And this is where China emerges as an alternative, in many cases, more available than Western alternatives, but economically also more feasible and more affordable. But again, this raises the issue of American sanctions to block Chinese technological access to its own partners, allies. So this becomes quite a promising field, but at the same time, quite a controversial field, which is making the Gulf-China partnership politically sensitive as well. And then in recent years, even we see potential cooperation, some steps toward partnership in military technology, defense industry, etc. Lastly, we can also emphasize the maritime security. We know the importance of maritime security considerations, freedom of navigation, ensuring the security of the sea lines. And as we have observed in the last year or so, since October 23, the situation around Yemen, Gulf of Aden, it's an important topic, not only for China, but all actors. So global connectivity depends on the freedom of navigation in the high seas. And this is where there are important overlapping interests. And I think the Gulf countries expect China to play larger roles here, as we have seen in the case of the Houthi attacks on the international navigation. They're expecting China to play a larger role to stall such attacks. But beyond that, connectivity, especially post-COVID recovery, global supply lines, again, ensuring maritime security is very important for the Gulf, for China in the global transit of goods in all directions between East and West, considering the location of the Gulf in the middle. So these are more or less a couple of main drivers, but as I said, we need to also be attentive to the nuances, differences across the GCC countries when it comes to their relations with China.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaban, for this thorough overview, and also thank you for also putting it into the context of great power competition and how the Arab Gulf or the Gulf in general will actually be a good example of how this great power competition will play out. And now, particularly with the election of President Donald Trump, and with the ongoing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, it will be also interesting to look at the European perspective to see how, in the midst of all these changes and shifts, Europe is looking at the situation, how it is expected to respond, and what role it is expected to take. And with that, I give the floor to Camille to give us her perspective on these questions. And please briefly introduce yourself, Camille.
Thank you very much, Lara, and thank you for having me for this very interesting conversation. So my name is Camille Lons. I am the deputy head of the Paris office of a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations. We are a pan-European think tank with offices across Europe, and I'm also a policy fellow with the Middle East program of that think tank. And I work quite a lot on what China-Gulf relations and what that means for the Europeans. So from a European perspective, there's no clear European understanding at the moment of how this rising Chinese influence in the MENA region is going to impact our interests. It's still quite a niche topic. We're not as advanced as the US on that debate, but also one of the issues is that there is no really united European position, neither on China nor on the Middle East. And without entering too much in the details, but France, Germany, more Southern European countries, Eastern European countries have quite different positions when it comes to how they address China and how they look at the Middle East region. However, what we see in recent years is two phenomenon on these things. First, we see a sharpening of the European position on China in recent years, where the kind of systemic rival element is becoming more and more predominant. So, like the Europeans, when they talk about China, there is this kind of triangle of China as a partner, as an economic competitor, and as a systemic rival. And the systemic rival element has taken more and more space now in Europe's foreign policy. So there is that. And when it comes to the Middle East, and especially the GCC, because we're talking about the Gulf here, we see also in recent years a growing European interest in trying to engage more with GCC partners, both on regional issues, but also like looking at GCC countries as global players that we can engage on wider issues. And so you know that the first EU GCC summit took place just last month. And so what we see is that both on the China issue and on GCC countries, the Europeans are going towards a bit more convergence on their positions, and this is something positive. We have, a new commissioners coming at the EU level. The High Representative Kaja Kallas is quite hawkish. I mean, she's known for being a bit more hawkish on China, a bit less interested in the Middle East. So we can expect that this is also at the EU level going to shape a little bit how the EU is looking at China's presence in the Middle East. I think this competition element with China is going to be quite predominant. For the Europeans, they look at China a lot through like the main angles at the moment when you look at European foreign policy priorities or the Ukraine war, and so China's support to Russia in the Ukraine conflict, and the kind of geoeconomic industrial competitiveness issue, where again the industrial dependency on China is seen as something highly problematic. And so now, as you mentioned, with Trump's re-election, it's quite difficult to predict how this is going to shape things, because Trump by definition is a very unpredictable actor, but we can expect already that this is going to have quite important repercussions on how the Europeans deal with China, how they deal with the Middle East. So there's a lot to watch on that space. But maybe just to very briefly give an overview of how they look at China in the region, because this systemic rival element is quite predominant now. They look at China's presence in the Gulf through mostly the kind of security angle and how this is, the risk angle, like how this is impacting our interest potentially. I would say the biggest issue for Europeans at the moment is more the big picture influence, where we see that Europeans in general over recent years have seen their ability to shape developments in the Middle East decrease over time. The fact that China is rising in the region is giving regional powers more leverage and more bargaining power in their relationship with European players. We see also the rise in the Gulf of this narrative of the declining West that has been even further reinforced in the current conflict in the Middle East by this idea of double standards. And so the Europeans are really getting weakened, and the fact that new powers like China are emerging is seen as a concern for Europeans and for their ability to really shape what's happening just at in their direct neighborhood. And then you have a whole set of other potential risks in terms of energy security when it comes to the Gulf, like how much, if China becomes the priority of Gulf energy exporters, how much will the Europeans have leverage in case of a big energy need? Risks in terms of port access, critical infrastructures, if again, like the BRI becomes quite prominent and Chinese investments in those infrastructures become problematic. Same for digital infrastructures. There's the question of transfer of sensitive technologies to China through the Gulf states. And to give you an example, especially in the military field, the UAE has been conducting shared exercises with China earlier this year using the French fighter jets Mirage. And that's, for example, that's a good example of risk of transfer of potential sensitive technologies, especially military technologies to China through these countries. You have the question of de-dollarization, how this is impacting the broader international financial system. So you have a lot of questions, and there is also the kind of more long-term thing that Europeans are looking at, which is that how in the case of an escalation around Taiwan, for example, like how would Gulf states also react? We've seen already in the case of the Ukraine conflict that they've been very reluctant to align with Western positions on Russia, that they have served for some of them as way to circumvent some of the European sanctions on Russia. So it's seen a bit as Ukraine as a potential test of what could happen in case of an escalation in the Indo-Pac. You know, now the question is, what does that mean? What can we do? I'll speak about that in the second thing, but like how Europeans can respond to that.
Actually, thank you so much, Camille. Yeah, you can just continue, but I wanted to follow up on your output. First, I want to thank you for outlining the risks and the different positions within the EU. And with that, I would like to move on to a more constructive, let's say, discussion on what are potential areas of cooperation between the three regions, what are areas of common interest, whether in terms of economic gains, but also in the realm of mediation and conflict transformation, especially in a region that is now transforming and full of conflicts, basically. So go ahead.
Sure. So I'll make a few points on basically, I think there is a need for a threefold approach from the Europeans, which is on issues that are like where there is a real risk that I outlined. I think it's important to still have a firm position and put some red lines to some of the Gulf partners. And I think like specifically for like this issue of military tech and the Mirage case, I think is one of the cases where the Europeans could put more red lines on where their interests are being at threat. And I think this is an important conversation to have with Gulf partners. There is red lines, there is how they can I'm not talking about like countering China, but like how they can position themselves as alternative partners to China, to the Gulf states, in a moment when the Gulf states are trying to diversify the partnerships. And finally, yes, trying to think, as you said, about positive engagement. But I think it's important when we talk about positive engagement to also talk about the more difficult questions and the risks at play, because there is a big debate in Europe at the moment on whether we should always try to find positive engagement solutions with China, and the premise that in the current context of growing rivalries at the global landscape, it might be important for the Europeans also not to be too naive in the way they interact with China. So yes, we're trying to find a positive ways to cooperate, but at the same time, also showing red lines, also being very clear on where our interests are. And so there are a few things. I said we can position ourselves as alternative partners to the Gulf states. This can be part of actually the de-risking policies of supply chains toward China that the European countries are putting in place. And actually, the Gulf states are currently positioning themselves on this because they see a possibility as the Europeans, but also the US, are de-risking their supply chains from China, of them positioning themselves as these kind of trade interconnectors, either as manufacturing hubs or re-export hubs, and in that sense they would help the de-risking strategies of the Europeans, and at the same time that would advance their own economic diversification agenda as putting themselves at the center of global supply chains. So that could be a kind of win-win situation. And because the Europeans realize it's impossible to completely cut all their economic ties from China, having these kind of intermediaries in the Gulf, but also in other countries, is a way to, advance a little bit the diversification, the de-risking strategy without going for a complete cut, which is impossible anyways. There is also the possibility, and that continues with that, of trying to explore cooperation with other like-minded Asian powers, IMEC, so the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. It was an example of that. It's been put on pause for, strong political reasons with the current conflict. But, this is one of these attempts to explore a triangular relationship between Gulf states, India. It can be also Gulf states and Japan, especially in fields of energy. There's already some potential cooperation happening on hydrogen, green hydrogen. So, how can we offer alternatives? And finally, yes, what are the areas of positive engagement? One that I think is quite immediate is going to be on Iran. And there's a big need right now in times of, regional escalation and risk of escalation. China has played a relatively positive role in getting to the JCPOA, to the nuclear deal, and cooperating with the Europeans on that. It has played a positive role in the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, although there are limits to what China can deliver on that deal. But here, there might be something to engage China and Gulf countries on trying to keep that channel that diplomatic channel between the Gulf states and Iran. And especially, we know in the context of Trump coming back to the White House, and where there is a risk of the US putting back the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, the Gulf states are going to be interested in maintaining that relationship with Iran. And so the Europeans should try to find a way to engage with these different players, and that includes China. There is also the maritime security issue on the Red Sea. Because China is quite dependent on that waterway and could play a bigger role. It has a base in Djibouti. Here, I would be a bit more nuanced on how far we can go on the cooperation, because what we see also from the recent events in the Red Sea is that China has been relatively hands-off from the crisis and not willing too much to intervene. And there is a big debate in Europe at the moment on whether China is really an actor of, interested in that much instability in that part of the world. And just to explain myself what I mean, and I'm interested to hear my colleagues, especially Dr. Zhou on this, but there has been a belief for a long time that China was interested in stability as an essential part of its foreign policy, including in the Middle East, because stability allows you to trade, and this is important for the BRI. But what we see in the current crisis is that China can accommodate with a certain degree of instability when this instability has disproportionate detrimental effects on the US, and this is what we're seeing in the current crisis. And so, yes, it is impacting the Chinese like everyone else, the fact that there is instability in the Red Sea, but at the same time, the current conflict is also hurting a lot of the US image in the broader region. And to that extent, the Chinese are not so keen to intervene and try to solve the current situation. And I think that's something to take into consideration when we think about, should we engage with China positively on this, or should we also be mindful about what Chinese core interests are in this context? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camille. Indeed, very interesting, and there's a lot of food for thought there. And it's interesting that you mentioned also toward the beginning, you mentioned red lines, that Europe should work with red lines with the Arab Gulf. And with that, I also want to ask Dr. Shaban about how the perception or how it will be received, these red lines. What kind of limits are we talking about? And what are also the Gulf countries' red lines respectively?
Thank you. I mean, maybe I don't like the term red lines much, personally. And also, I don't think states like to be told their red lines by others. So maybe let's talk about the strategic limitations of the Gulf European engagement, constraints, structural constraints. So we need to be honest about this relationship between the EU and the Gulf. So there is definitely a renewed interest. We see the appointment of a special envoy by the EU, declaration of a strategy document, and recent summits just recently. Let's speak. It's on the agenda. But I am Turkish, So we know the EU outlines such grand visions. Camille is smiling about the Mediterranean, Central Asia from time to time, but they don't always go as initially planned. So there are structural limitation constraints. Maybe one of the reasons why they don't go too far is because the other side of the equation, they don't want to be told about the red lines, what they should or shouldn't do. And they don't want to frame and define their relationship with the EU based on the EU's own concerns about China or Russia. That's important here. So I don't think anybody, any leader in the Gulf is interested in just defining their relationship with China the way Europeans want them to design, okay? So that's a very important point. As I said, as was discussed so far, I mean, there is a structural incompatibility here. So after years, decades of deeper engagement, now the West is talking about decoupling from China. That's a major trajectory. And the Gulf is discovering China, moving toward China, okay? So these are two opposite movements. You need to see this. So if we are confronted with such opposites, I don't think the Gulf countries will just design, shape their relationship with China from the perspective of how the West sees it, how especially Europeans see it. And then the second point, which is important here, this renewed European interest in deepening the engagement with the Gulf. We also know that it is triggered by the other big crisis, which is the Russia question, post-Ukraine, post-22. Energy crunch, all these discussions, we are aware. So right now, when we just look at Europe and the Gulf angle, leaving aside the China question, it is driven by a short-term development, which may potentially have mid to long-term implications. It's a major game changer, right? What happened since 22? Today we are talking about potential nuclear war, if we can, the international community can deal with this kind of escalation. So everybody is rethinking their strategic priorities. So do the Gulf countries. So what Camille was saying about facilitating Russia's war machine, things like that, I don't think people see it from that angle here. So there is a new reading of the new geopolitical reality for the EU. The big question is whether this short-term window can be used to develop a longer-term relationship. So here are my constraints. The moral question, interests versus values. So still the inherent contradiction or dilemma in the EU policies toward other regions, third countries, it is still there. I mean, in the case of the Gulf, we will have to see how Europe will handle this question, moral versus interest-driven policies towards the Gulf. There is the democracy issue. But let's look at the other side of the coin. Since October last year, the moral failure of the West in general, right? Europe in particular, some governments, especially Germany, their loss of credibility, prestige in this part of the world, this is also shaping the perceptions toward Europe. So there are, of course, different angles to your question, but one big issue is leaving aside all these limitation constraints, what will be the files, the issues on which Gulf and Europe can realistically cooperate. There is the security issue, definitely. But again, here, limitations of Europe itself. What kind of a strategic actor the EU is? The failure of the strategic autonomy discussions. What kind of a global actor the EU is? These are still unanswered questions. Maybe the post-Trump discussions about Trump-proofing Europe, globally saving the international norm-based order. Definitely, the Europeans need global allies in that agenda, but to what extent they can be the global leaders. To what extent they can shape coalitions, they can form and drive coalitions to pursue some global agenda. I have doubts on that. And in the shorter term, the big question is related to what I just said earlier regarding the US security provision to the Gulf countries. In case of a US withdrawal from security provision, can the Europeans rise to the challenge of acting as the external security providers? Again, we don't have a clear answer. There is not a big clarity. But on other areas, which was also discussed earlier, the energy transition toward greener forms of energy, technology, partnerships like maritime security, and then, of course, other unconventional forms of security challenges, threats. There are definitely areas where the Gulf and EU would be finding it easy to coordinate. But in this endeavor, I guess the sort of some of the constraints that I just highlighted are still there. There is no clear answer. But again, the language of red lines, that's a non-starter. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaban, for outlining your inputs and for bringing in also the big picture. So I would like now to move to the Chinese perspective on what Dr. Shaban just mentioned and what Camille also mentioned, and also taking into consideration the perspectives, the Western perspective of Chinese, what they call first hedging, but now I see there's a lot of reference to wedging, to the Chinese role in that. So tell us more about that from your perspective, and also maybe if you can also tell us more about some areas of positive cooperation also in terms of mediation and conflict transformation and cooperation in that regard. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Lara, and also thanks for the previous two speakers. I also learned a lot, even given all those maybe some kind of difference in our perspective of the understanding the situation, but I still appreciate all those input. I will first start like, I will say China still thinks whole MENA regions, also all the whole Gulf regions is still, we say, strategic middle ground in the global affairs, which means that all the major powers should coexist peacefully in this region. I think this is also in line with the majority thinking of the Gulf Arabic countries, which like you can go west, also you can go east. You are in a much more autonomous, like strategic status. So in this regard, I think if we could shift some of the understandings of the China's current engagement with the Gulf Arabic countries, probably some kind of concern are unnecessary, because certainly China is not trying to build a kind of, we say, wedging or we say anti-West coalition in the Gulf regions. All of our partnership, of our relationship with the Gulf Arabic countries are partnership, and also China maintained the partnership with the Iran. I would say before China's mediation of the Saudi Arabia and Iran last year, for pretty long time, when we talk about Middle East affairs, I'm always questioned about how China can manage these two relationships together in the same time. But I would say this is China's diplomatic principle, and also this is also our China diplomatic practice. And actually, I would say this so far it works well, and also. The second is like in this type of the engage, if we want to have some possible areas of cooperation, certainly I would say we can think about many areas of the cooperation between China and the EU, mostly on the development side, from the green technology, from the infrastructure, even from the trade issues, from the energy issues. Certainly, I would say many areas of the cooperation. And probably we can even spend a whole day listing all the area of cooperation, especially since I would say maybe in 2015 that time, China have also in that time it's EU who proposed with China the idea of the third party cooperation. And certainly I would say the Gulf Arabic countries could be a very good area of such type of the trial. For example, China's expertise in the infrastructure, in the new technology, and the Europeans' expertise in finance, in management could be combined together. But currently, the problem for the cooperation, I would say, it has also been laid out by our previous speakers. Is on the currently the EU's security concern on China, and also some of the, I would say some of the blame on China's, we say, want to play some blame that China is kind of playing some, we say, geopolitical game in the Gulf regions. But for me, I don't think China is actually playing some kind of geopolitical game in the regions. And I think, and also some of the security issues, and also we also needed to address analysis, study the root cause of many security issues in the regions. Like, for example, for the current Red Sea maritime security, I would say if you look at the China Gulf 2022, there's a joint statement. In that statement, it says very clearly that China also opposes any kind of the Houthis, any kind of threat from Yemen conflict to the maritime security in the Red Sea. And also, which in that time, actually, some of the statement in that, some of the words in that statement actually make Iran not happy in that time. That's also a kind of a case in point. And also for the, but if you look at the current Red Sea crisis, we need to see that all those crises starts from after the October 7th last year. And we all see that it's because the current ongoing Gaza conflict that makes the situation worse. And also China is trying to make a lot of diplomatic resources in trying to address the security conflict in Gaza. So I would say that China certainly, because in the Chinese idea, like if you want to address a kind of a security conflict, you need to see about its root cause. For the Red Sea security, if this time the Red Sea crisis is on the Gaza, so we should address the Gaza issues. And also, we also need to see, don't forget, like in the Gaza issues, it's not China who vetoed 5 times in the United Nations Security Council about those called ceasefire proposal, the resolution. It's not China, it's the United States. So sometimes if you want China to cooperate in this issue, certainly I think EU and China should think about maybe even some cooperation in the Security Council for the Palestinian issues. That could be a good starting point for China to play a more influential role in Red Sea. A same logic can be applied to the JCPOA and the Iran issues. China is also maintaining a comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran. But also, if you look at the current Iran, the nuclear, also the issues in Iran, also it's not China who withdraw the JCPOA issues. Also, China tried sometimes to save the deal, but it's also not China. So if you want, in this case, so I would say in the current, if you want to, because we have heard for numerous times from our EU friends, also from other, like our colleagues in the other countries, like China should work more on the JCPOA on the Red Sea. But we should also, usually we need to see that certainly China is willing to play a more constructive role in all the security issues in the Gulf regions. But also we need to, don't forget the elephant in the room. We need to see who caused the current issues. And also certainly I would say that if we want China to expend more diplomatic resources in these regions, a certain kind of the international coordination between China and EU in terms of the JCPOA in Iran and the Red Sea is needed. And certainly I think EU in this part should have a more strategic autonomous stance in terms of issues. For example, China and the EU in some level, we should at least have some joint stance and transfer this stance to the United States to these issues. Certainly because for all the Red Sea issues, for all the JCPOA issues, if we want to solve these issues, certainly we need to have like a consensus among all major powers. And certainly China have its leverage. For example, its leverage on the Iran, its leverage on the Gulf Arabic countries. EU has its own leverage. Its leverage on the United States. Certainly, I would say is much bigger than China. So if like we should combine those leverage together to form another kind of international consensus in this region. And that goes back to my original first point. That is China's wish of building a more, we say, a peaceful coexistence of all major powers in the Middle East. This is certainly a very great, I would say, in the interest for both all the major powers and also in the regional countries. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your inputs and for your responses. Also, I find this discussion extremely enriching with all its diversity and bringing in the different perspectives. That's the whole point of these dialogues, to bring in all the perspectives, but also to help us highlight the common areas and common interests that that these different actors can work together on. One of them, of course, is the ongoing conflict you mentioned in Gaza. And all of these parties, we're talking about China, Europe, and the Gulf, have an active interest in the end of conflict and instability. And maybe this is an area that we can talk about areas of cooperation. Thank you so much. I think now it's time to open it up to questions from our attendees. And we have already 3 questions. I would start with a question from our colleague, Christian, who's the head of the MENA unit. He was asking, with the new US administration very likely focusing on bilateral arrangements with Gulf countries, undermining GCC, will China support EU efforts strengthening ties with the GCC? Dr. Chichi, would you like to answer that, or anyone else?
Okay, I think China is always like welcome to any, we say, the bilateral, we say, the multilateral engagement of the other country of the other countries in the world. So I think even for the China for EU's relationship with the GCC, I think China is no problem with that. But of course, China may oppose it if, for example, the issue about the so-called red line. If wanted the GCC countries to cut some of its cooperation with China, then I think China will certainly have some problem, maybe have some different opinion of this type of the cooperation. But if this is just like its own, we say, bilateral cooperations, I think China will have no problem with that. Yeah.
If I may just say something quickly on the bilateral versus GCC thing. I don't think this is necessarily the US that is going to undermine the GCC by bilateral engagement. I think the GCC in itself is, less and less powerful as an organization, as a political organization, and all players, whether it's China, whether it's European countries, whether it's the US, all deal quite, tend to prefer bilateral ties with big GCC players because this is how things are happening.
Thank you, Camille. Dr. Shaban?
Actually, I was going to underline the same point. It's not about even the strength of the GCC itself. It is the style of the GCC countries, their preference for transactional mode of relationship, and especially the new administration's preference for a similar arrangement. So if push comes to shove, if they have to choose, probably they would go rather with bilateral deals than trying to push for a multilateral inclusive agenda, which will be much more time-consuming. So that's one of the patterns of the pragmatic diplomatic practices here, not just because of the weakness of the GCC as a regional actor.
Thank you so much for your responses. I will move on to another question we have. What does Europe want to achieve with China on foreign and security policy? What China can deliver to the Gulf region? What are challenges? Okay, so maybe we start with the first one. What does Europe want to achieve with China on foreign and security policy? You want to take that, Camille?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's difficult to summarize in 1 minute. And this is what I was trying to say at the beginning. There are a number of priorities. There is a big debate at the moment on EVs and tariffs and industrial, competition. And the dependency of European countries on China when it comes to green tech and a lot of other things. So there is a big like geoeconomic issue that is on the top, and there is the big geopolitical question around Ukraine. Like the Europeans are trying at the moment to engage with China, and it's difficult to say, but like try to ask China to limit its support to Russia in the Ukraine crisis. Not that the Europeans can do much about it anyways, but I would say these are like the two key priorities, and this is going to be probably reshuffled quite a lot, also depending on how the new Trump administration reacts and adapts its own China policy, because probably with Trump's own tariffs, we'll see a lot of flows of China's, industrial capacity flowing back into Europe. So, it's difficult to summarize like one key priority of the Europeans when it comes to their China policy. But yeah.
Thank you. An interesting follow-up also by the same attendee is, what can China deliver to the Gulf region that Europe cannot deliver?
Okay. I think for these issues, China and the EU is not necessarily in those type of so-called logic of the zero game, right? The zero-sum game in the Middle East. There are nothing, or I would say, we should not think about that there's something like China can do that Europe cannot. There's something EU can do, China cannot. We should think about things in a more, with a complementary ways. But if I want to, I don't know if I want to address these issues, at least there's one thing that China probably is better than, I cannot say better, maybe different from the EU. Is like China don't use the word such as, for example, the setting a red line for Gulf Arabic countries. Yeah, and though usually we also don't do some so-called become we don't position ourselves as we say a teacher of the Gulf Arabic countries. Like I want to teach you on those maybe some kind of values of something. Usually China don't do that things. Yeah, that's maybe a little bit. That's maybe a difference.
Dr. Shaban, would you like to add something?
Actually, the last point, I completely agree, I guess. I want to second, I mean, not to be told, but again, I mean, the technology angle here, the advanced technologies and the Western concerns to share certain technologies with the third parties, it's important. This is where China has certain advantages, and practically speaking. And also the massive infrastructure projects, the transformation, like huge port projects, industrial zones, technological zones connected to bigger major infrastructure transportation projects. These are the things the West is lagging behind. So there is a discussion about recently, the American shipyards, whether they can match with the Chinese shipyards in terms of producing the same amount of warships increasingly. I mean, here the important point is the industrialization that the West has gone through in recent decades versus China's advantages and the developmental plans of the Gulf countries. So there are, I think, important areas where China has the upper edge compared to Europe and also the West. These are important things to keep in mind.
Thank you, Dr. Shaban. Camille?
Yes, if I can just jump in quickly to add something that China is bringing to the Gulf states from the European perspective is this point I was making about, and it was very interesting because I did a lot of interviews with, Saudis, Emiratis, etc. And they were saying basically China, the rise of China has diminished for them the cost of diminish the cost of opposing the US or Western partners. It gives them more leverage also on the international scene, this relationship with China. I think this is also a big element of the relationship. And just to like quickly say, because I want to respond to the red lines point that has, I see, raised a lot of answers and debate. And so for the sake of debate, just to explain a little bit further what I meant, I don't mean necessarily imposing a lot of red lines. When I said red lines, it would be very limited just because also Europeans don't have the leverage to impose a lot of red lines. Unfortunately, we don't have that power. But at the same time, I think on very specific things, like typically the use of military technologies that can be sensitive for us, I think it's important to be clear. I mean, and then we have the leverage on that to put some red lines and to say, we sell you some advanced, military technologies. The French military technology is, it's not the same level as the US, but it's quite significant. And so we have some leverage to, tell you like this is a problem for us if you use these technologies doing, I don't know, shared exercise with China. So we have like small elements of leverage like this. And when Dr. Shaban Kardash was saying that the Gulf countries don't calibrate their relationship with China based on Western concerns or demands, actually, they completely do. They would like not to, they would like to decouple completely their relations with China from the relations with the US, but they cannot because at the moment, what we see is the Saudis are negotiating with the US a big kind of grand bargain security deal. And one of the big elements that the US is putting at the table is the relationship with China. And the Gulf states are kind of calibrating, their relationship with China as a kind of bargaining leverage, but at the same time, they have to make concessions. The UAE made concessions on its tech relationship with China to be able to advance, like G42, especially the AI company, to advance a big deal with Microsoft. So there is a lot of bargaining happening here. And I think like the big issue for the Gulf states is how do they manage to find the balance between the interest they have with the Europeans, because they do have a lot of interest with the Europeans, European companies or advanced, the European market is very important for their economic diversification strategy. So, how do they balance between all the different players and interests in a moment of greater tensions at the global level?
Thank you, Camille, also for clarifying. Dr. Shaban, you have a response?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. Thank you, Camille. I mean, here exactly the point, what I was trying. So these are constraints that they are taking into account, but they are not the main determinants of the Gulf policies on China. Yes, I mean, we are living in an interdependent world, right? This is the basics of a global world. You are interdependent. You have to factor into your relationship with country X, your relationship with country Y. This is the basics. This is the essentials of globalized interdependent relationships. But beyond that, shaping entirely from the perspective of the other actor. This is what I meant. They wouldn't go that far. And then military, yeah, I mean, I also agree with you on that. I mean, dual use technologies sometimes, and also using the Western military arsenal and bringing in the Chinese or Russian. In the case of Turkey, we had the same problem. This is not a simple thing, of course. It raises big pressure on the relationship, and there is a make or break point if you push too far. I mean, these things nobody would accept, not only the West, and China wouldn't accept the same if it was the main arms provider to a country and letting that country to just bring in Western military equipment. So, I mean, these are on the military side more mutually exclusive, I agree, but like softer technologies, this is where the problem starts, especially on the dual use question. It becomes even more complicated.
Thank you. Dr. Chichi, did you have a comment on the same topic?
Yeah, just a very short sentence. Since we just also, I think also learned a lot from the chemist's point on the red line and focus on the military. So I kind of also understand this type of concern. But sometimes we should also look at the also a root cause of the why many Gulf Arabic countries are so obsessed with the so-called armed race and armed itself. It's because the insecurity from the, we say, the current the regional security situation. But and so in this regard, so I think if, for example, China and the EU, and also we can take United States together, can work on some kind of joint security architectures, inclusive architectures in the Gulf regions. By the way, China has already have like a, with a kind of initiatives into the Gulf Arabic region, into the whole Gulf regions. If such type of the security architecture could be established, probably I would say the Gulf Arabic countries will have less demand for those type of, we say, the very sensitive military technologies. Then this type of concern of the transferring of the military weapons could also be weakened. This type of concern could also be assured. So this is also just one point I just think about. Thank you.
I'm very sorry, I have to jump it because I have to leave, and sorry for leaving in advance, but thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Camille.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Chichi, there's a question for you. What relationship has China with Israel? Partnership, order, strategic partnership? Can China mediate in the conflict?
Yeah. Thank you for this question. For Israel, China is also in there's a partnership relationship, partnership. I think China has maintained at least a partnership with all the major MENA countries. Yeah, almost all the MENA countries, and Israel maybe, but of course that partnership was established maybe several long before the October 7th. After October 7th, certainly China is opposing the current what Israel did, and also what the United States and Israel did in the Gaza. And China opposed these actions. But also, that doesn't mean that China opposed Israel. I would say this is also, we should notify this type of this difference. China opposed what Israel did in the Gaza and the Palestinian issues, but China does not oppose this type of, China have a partnership relationship with Israel. For China's mediation in the conflict, I'm assuming this is the current Palestinian and Israel conflict. China is doing, like you can see, China is mediating between the different Palestinian factions. This is kind of a way to strengthen the Palestinian side, because if you look at the current Palestinian conflict, one of the major reasons is also the very asymmetrical balance of power. Israel is very strong and the Palestinian side is divided and weak. And certainly we should find some means to strengthen Palestinian side, at least from the diplomatic and political dimension. But if you say China want to have a much more important role, I think still it needs some kind of international cooperation. China has been calling, I would say this is a direct call from the President Xi Jinping, which is an international conference on the Palestinian issues with a much more inclusive international peace conference on the Palestinian issues. And we are also, I think, recently, if you look at the Saudi Arabia has made an international coalition on the two-state solution, and China's special envoy in the Middle East has just joined the conference in Riyadh on this issue. I think China is also willing to launch some kind of the international cooperation to support the Palestinian side.
Thank you so much for highlighting the areas of Chinese mediation also in the conflict historically and currently. We have another question. Economic relations between the GCC and China and other big Asian economies have been rapidly growing, but growth is mostly driven by fossil fuel trade and rising oil prices. So how can China actually contribute to the Gulf economic diversification plans? And do the speakers think it can do so more substantially than Europe? We always have this comparative lens coming up. Who would like to answer?
Yeah, very briefly, I am not an economist. I am not good at numbers, but just simple observation. I don't think the growth in the trade volumes can be explained only by the fossil fuel trade. That's not the case. I mean, the global oil prices did not change significantly to explain the volume. I mean, if I were an economist, probably I would know the percentage of oil and gas within the overall trade volumes. Even like if you take the case of UAE, China, all sorts of goods, consumer goods, electronics, all sorts of chemicals. So, I mean, this is not the case. I mean, the trade is more diversified and the growing volume owes to other items as well. And then I guess what role China can play relates to what I just said earlier in the previous round, that as part of the economic diversification plans, these countries want to be hubs in the global transportation networks, logistical hubs for international trade. There are projects about technology zones, industrial zones, so on and so forth, in addition to the transportation corridors, connected to the transportation corridors. And these are the areas where China has, again, I repeat the same point, a competitive edge, considering the sort of the industrialization the West has been going through. And this is where I guess the overlapping interests cannot be excluded.
Thank you so much. Dr. Chichi, do you have a response?
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Sabans on his point. And I think we should not just think about the China and the GCC countries' relationship just in the from dimension of the energy, oil energy. Actually, it's because if you look at the current China economic structure, because of course maybe you can hear some news like economic growth in China is slowing down, but actually also if you look at the adjustment of structures, China's economic structures are also getting into a more, we say, into a high-tech development stage in this type of regard, which also means that certainly China is developing a lot of the new areas of the economic cooperation with the Gulf countries. If you look at the recent reports, a lot of the China and the GCC country cooperation are in the green sectors, like in the solar panels, in the electronic vehicles, in this regard, those kind of non-fossil oil sectors. This plays a growing, and also another sector, which is also, I think, mentioned by Dr. Saban, which is financial cooperations. Yeah, the so-called sovereign, the GCC sovereign funds. Actually, they are also very active in China's financial market.
It's a two-way relationship, I guess.
Yeah, two-way relationship. Yeah, exactly.
Point to keep in mind. It's not one-way Gulf on the receiving end of the relationship. So it's also giving, and that's why prospects for multiplication, spillover are much higher here.
Indeed. We have a question. Could you please speak to the question of China, Iran, and the Gulf in Syria? Would we see a Chinese role in reconstruction in Syria and pushing for a peace process? Or because of Russian presence in the country, China might not be as proactive? I would like to answer that.
Okay. You mean, just let me take a look at the question. Also, so you mean like China's role in the mediation of the Syria? See, sorry, I think you are on mute.
Sorry,
I guess both mediation
and reconstruction,
like peace process, but also post conflict reconstruction.
If you look at China's role in the Syria, so far I think Syria is also, I think China just maintained just established also a partnership, I think strategic partnership with the Syria. And I think China is also willing to promote the so-called a more political dialogue inside Syria, but certainly on the basis of the respect of the sovereignty of the Syria. And also, I think there are also something you need to see, like China is also contributing to the Syria process. Like when Syria is going to normalize its relationship with Arab League, like China is also playing a lot in this process. So I think China is, for Syria, there's still some room to play, but I think China's role, certainly, I think China's stance will be actually different from the current, the Russian one and also the other side's one. China's one will still play more, on the one hand, the first is economic reconstruction. The other side is also promote some kind of the join in some kind of multilateral mechanisms on the Syria to promote the political dialogue inside Syria on the basis of respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the sovereignty of the Syria.
Yeah, a few points on the same question. Of course, the first issue is how to reach the peace in Syria. I mean, move beyond the current stalemate in the civil war on the ground. We don't know. We don't have a clear roadmap how that post-conflict phase will come out. This is important because who's going to dictate the terms? Whether the transition to the post-conflict phase will be because of Western American-led initiative, or Russia will play a bigger role, the outcomes for reconstruction will be different. But what we know in any case, somebody will have to pay the bill, right? Reconstruction, it won't be on the cheap, as we know in Syria, more than a decade of conflict, the amount of destruction of the civilian infrastructure, all sorts of infrastructure in many parts of the country. The question is, what kind of funding international donor mechanism will emerge? Who is going to be paying the bill for reconstruction? The Europeans? For a while, we were debating it like a couple of years ago, 5-6 years ago, when there was a refugee crisis in Europe, right? So maybe they were ready to pay the bill so that they don't receive refugees. But is the EU willing to pay the bill for reconstruction? We don't know. After Ukraine, it's a completely different reality. Can the Gulf countries pay the bill? Are they willing to pay? We don't know, beyond the normalization. This is important again. It depends on who will do the reconstruction work on the ground, okay? So comparing to Russia, of course, China has advantages. Chinese constructors in many parts of the world, they are #1, right, worldwide in construction, and they have overtaken Turkish companies in many places. So, I mean, you need to look at the actors that can do work, that can deliver on the ground in reconstruction. Turkey is there, China is there, and Russians will not be. But again, it depends on the entry of China into Syria. It's already there, but the extent of Chinese involvement will depend on the funding, the donor mechanism that will shape the post-conflict reconstruction. But still, China has advantages, even if it is a Western-led process. Look at the case of Iraq, right, post-2003. Although it was a US-led reconstruction phase, still the Chinese companies were the big winner. So still in Syria, I would say China stands a good chance in terms of benefiting from a post-conflict reconstruction bonanza, but with all the caveats that I just underlined.
Thank you so much for your very insightful answers. We have a final question. Sorry, there's a follow-up question. Perhaps first time I have a follow-up on Lebanon. How would China collaborate with the Gulf on the post-war political arrangements in Lebanon, especially with the decline of Hezbollah and also in light of its relation with Iran? Many thanks for that. Shall I repeat the question? Or
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think As for the Lebanon, I think certainly if you look at the current, usually as long as China is having any with a joint statement with the Arabic League or with it in the also China Arabic Cooperation Forum, and as long as in the Lebanon, I think China is certainly had this intention to work also with the regional countries because to play a constructive role in making generally we say the MENA region is a more stable place. This is actually the principle. Like in our, if you look at our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like we say anything that is great for the stability of the region is what China would like to follow. This is certainly a thing. But if you want to ask very specifically about the China's role into like in the very specific political arrangement of Lebanon, I think so far we still need to wait and see. I think this is still because China do have the principle of the non-interference of the other countries' politics, and also for the Lebanon, if you look at the Lebanon issues, you see this is a country certainly have suffered a lot from the foreign interference. So sometimes, if you summarize a lot of Chinese approach to the conflict issues in the Middle East, China at least there's maybe one lesson China learned from the Middle East conflict is like China should have the principle of do no harm at least. Yeah, non-interference is that's the reason why China always upheld the principle of non-interference, because sometimes even interference of maybe a so-called benign intention can also create some unintended consequences.
Dr. Shaban, I see you smiling. Thank you, Dr. Chichi.
Yeah, good that China is taking lessons, and that's a good lesson for the Europeans. It shouldn't be a one-way relationship, teaching, but also learning in the process. Yeah, I mean, perhaps Lara, you can comment better than us about the role of Hezbollah, the place of Hezbollah in the future of Lebanon. I guess that's a huge issue, question, and I don't think Gulf, China can just do what some people want them to do. I mean, that's a sociological reality of Lebanese domestic context. And then Hezbollah will be there, will be part of Lebanese society, politics and security. And then, yeah, I mean, probably they can engage, but they cannot leverage Hezbollah to do certain things. And I can just say, underline this.
Thank you so much for your extremely rich and educational commentaries. With regards to Lebanon, I think the Gulf is busy with its own things. I think everyone is in the wait and see mode. So thank you so much anyway for all your contributions. We will be and thank you for the attendance of today, of the audience today. We will be producing a summary or blog post on this event, and we are very happy to continue working together on this topic and getting into more specific discussions. Thank you so much, Dr. Chichi. Thank you so much, Dr. Shaban. And thank you for everyone. And we look forward to having more of these discussions.